And welcome back to the SOF Spring Symposium, and a special welcome back to those new to the authorship issue. We have a very special Authorship 101 presentation coming up that I think you'll very much enjoy. My name is Don Rubin. I'm speaking to you from Toronto. I'm Vice President of the SOF and host for this second session of the day. We'll be starting in just a couple of minutes, and we should be ending at about 5:30 Eastern Time, about 2.25 hours from now. This session will also feature two major papers from Robert Prechter and Roger Stritmatter, a peek into the SOF's new Blue Boar Tavern, some information on the 2022 video contest this year with $3,000 in cash prizes, and some announcements about our upcoming live conference scheduled for September in Ashland, Oregon, home of the now experimental Oregon Shakespeare Festival. More on that later. Oh, yes, let me remind you that the chat function is off right now, so everyone can focus on the papers, but the question function will be on. If we have time at the end, we'll be offering up some of those questions to the speakers, but if not, we'll be passing them on and asking them to respond both personally and on the website. For now, let's get right to the question that I'm sure all of us had as we started our encounters with the authorship. Who was this guy Shakespeare? Our speaker is a former fellowship president, a Yale University grad, a Boston College Law School graduate, cum laude, no less. And since 2014, he's been the editor of the SOF's quarterly newsletter. By special video link, who was Shakespeare? A question that will be answered by Alex McNeil. Alex.
Hello, we've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's get right into it. As a matter of convention today, when I refer to the man from Stratford-on-Avon, I'm going to pronounce that Shakespeare with a short A and a short E. Spelling was inconsistent in those days, but most of the business records that refer to him use a short A and a short E. When I refer to the writer, whoever he may have been, I'm going to pronounce that Shakespeare with a long A and a long E. But let's actually start with Charles Dickens. How do we know that Dickens wrote Dickens? Well, his name is on the works. That is evidence, but it's not conclusive. More importantly, his life experiences are reflected in the works. He openly took credit for having written the works, and no one has ever suggested that he was not the author. Can we say the same about William Shakespeare of Stratford? How do we know? Well, his name, or a very similar name, is on the works, but there's a lack of corroborative evidence. His life is not consistent with that of the author. What we know of his life is not reflected in his works. He never took credit for having written anything, and suggestions that the name was some kind of pseudonym have been expressed since the name first appeared in print in 1593. Our theory is that Shakespeare served as a front man for someone whose real identity could not be divulged. What is the traditional biography of Shakespeare? That he was born in Stratford-on-Avon in 1564, received an excellent education at the town grammar school, went to London sometime in the 1580s where he became an actor, a shareholder in a theater, a poet, and a playwright. He got to know the Earl of Southampton, who became his patron. He bursts on the scene in 1593 as a mature, fully formed poet with no known prior poetic works. He was actively writing plays, acting, and managing a theater from the late 1580s to about 1611. He retired around 1612, moved back home to Stratford, died there in 1616. Some years later, two fellow actors gathered up the manuscripts of his plays and had them all published in 1623. The Stratford Monument was erected to him that year. Conventional biography, if read correctly, reasons backward from the conclusion. We know he wrote the works. We know when he lived. Therefore, he must have written the works during the time frame 1590 to 1611. Therefore, this is the life he lived. Careful bios always use qualifiers like must have, no doubt, we can be sure, etc. But we can't be sure. What do we actually know about the traditional biography? Very little. The second to the bottom line, the Folio was published in 1623, but it was not collected by two fellow actors. They were not the prime movers behind it. What is the verified biography of Shakespeare of Stratford? Well, there's no doubt that such a person existed, but only 5 facts are known about the first half of his life. His baptism in 1564, 2 records about his marriage in 1582, the birth of his first daughter in 1583, the birth of twins in 1585. He's in Stratford, married with 3 kids by the age of 21. His son died at age 11, but his 2 daughters would survive him. There's no evidence of schooling. Records for the Stratford Town Grammar School don't exist for this time. For the second half of his life, more is known. He's in London by the 1590s in connection with money lending. He's also in Stratford with various business dealings, buying and selling property. He's cited for hoarding grain during a time of famine. He sues locals for small debts. London authorities can't find him on 2 occasions. By 1600, he's become wealthy. He bought the second largest house in Stratford. He was a shareholder in a London theater. As a member of a theatrical company, he's one of several people awarded cloth to wear in a parade for King James in 1605. In 1612, he gives a deposition in a London lawsuit about his landlord's family dowry. He buys property in London in 1613. He makes his will in Stratford, dies, and is buried there in 1616. What do we not have evidence of? There's no evidence of education, as I said, because there's no records from the town grammar school. There's no letter from him, nor is there a reference to the existence of any such letter. Yet letters are common in the Shakespeare plays. If Shakespeare had business interests in Stratford while in London, we should expect to find evidence of correspondence. Only 1 letter was ever written to him. That was from a Stratford neighbor asking for a loan. There are only 2 contemporaneous records that anyone even spoke to him. One's from the Stratford town clerk on a property matter. One is from his fellow boarders in connection with the landlord's dowry lawsuit. There's no reference in his 3-page detailed will to books, manuscripts, or musical instruments, nor is there a bequest to the town school or a provision for the education of his 8-year-old granddaughter. No one in Stratford refers to him as a literary man. William Camden, in his 1605 book, Worthies of Stratford, doesn't mention him, yet Camden refers to the writer Shakespeare in another work. No one dedicated a literary work to him, nor did he dedicate anything to a fellow writer, though this was common. The London scene, it was a literary fraternity. They all knew each other. He's not mentioned in either of the 2 most detailed records of theatrical performances of the time, though titles of several Shakespeare plays are mentioned. His death in 1616 goes unnoticed in the literary world at a time when fellow writers did write poems and elegies at the death of one of their fellows. His 2 daughters, Susanna and Judith, who survived him, were illiterate. Yet Stephen Greenblatt, in his introduction to the Norton Shakespeare, says, quote, "It is striking how many of Shakespeare's women are shown reading." His son-in-law, a physician, John Hall, mentions treating, quote, "that excellent poet, Michael Drayton," but doesn't mention his father-in-law. Similarly, his daughters and his granddaughter, who survived until 1670, are not known to have mentioned his name. There's no evidence that he ever met the Earl of Southampton, his supposed patron, and there's no evidence that he traveled abroad. Well, you might say, this was 400 years ago, records get lost. And that's true, no doubt some records have gotten lost. But let's compare what we know about Shakespeare to what we know about some of his literary contemporaries. This is exactly what Diana Price did in her book, Shakespeare's Unorthodox Biography, about 20 years ago. She compared his biography to what is known of 24 literary contemporaries using 10 criteria relating toward connecting them to a literary life, what we would call corroborative evidence. You can see those 10 criteria here. Here's her scorecard. Ben Jonson scored a 10. He met all 10 of the criteria. Thomas Nash, 9, and so on. As you can see, the median score is a 6. John Webster scored below a 4. He only wrote 12 plays and a few poems. He scored a 3. And bringing up the rear is Shakespeare with 0. Recall, however, that Shakespeare was very active for at least 20 years. His career and his literary output were greater than most of these other 24 people, and much more effort has been spent in trying to flesh out his biography. You might ask, was Shakespeare of Stratford even literate? These are the only known signatures of Shakespeare. Many people may have illegible signatures, but people who are used to writing show consistency from one to the other. This looks like the hand of somebody who is not used to wielding a pen. And there's some evidence that these are not even done by him, that they were made by clerks trying to resemble somebody who couldn't write. Compare the signatures of other authors, which are quite easy to read: Mundy, Chapman, Dekker, and Drayton. There are numerous contemporary references to the author Shakespeare, but they don't establish the Stratford man was the author, just as a reference to the writer Mark Twain doesn't prove the existence of a real person by the name Mark Twain. It simply means that the name is out there. Indeed, several references to the author Shakespeare suggest that it's an illusion. One is to our English Terence. Terence was a Roman playwright widely believed to be a frontman for members of the Roman aristocracy. Another says, "Shakespeare, we must be silent in thy praise." Why must we be silent? Another one by Thomas Vickers in 1624 mentions, quote, "that famous poet who takes his name from shaking and spear," close quote. Yet Vickers mentions others by their actual names. This is the only name that he uses a circumlocution for. Could someone like Shakespeare, a commoner from a country town, have somehow acquired all that he needed to write this vast quantity of work? Yes, he could, but not without leaving any evidence that he did so. If you now have reasonable doubt about the Stratford man's claim to authorship, the question is, who is the real Shakespeare? Doubts about the Stratford man were expressed at the time, as I said. They resurfaced in the second half of the 19th century, and among the skeptics were Walt Whitman and Mark Twain himself. Some specific alternative candidates were proposed as early as the 1850s. But in 1920, J. Thomas Looney, a British schoolteacher, took a Sherlock Holmes approach. He reasoned that the author cannot help showing himself in the works. From his reading of Shakespeare, Looney prescribed 2 sets of 9 qualities: a man of recognized genius, apparently eccentric and mysterious; of intense sensibility, a man apart; unconventional, not adequately appreciated; of pronounced and known literary tastes; an enthusiast in the world of drama; a lyric poet of recognized talent; of superior education, classical, the habitual associate of educated people. Looney proposed a second list of criteria, also 9. A man of feudal connections, a member of the aristocracy, connected with the Lancastrian supporters during the War of the Roses; an enthusiast for Italy; a follower of sport, especially falconry, a sport that was reserved for the nobility; a lover of music; loose and improvident in money matters; doubtful and somewhat conflicting in his attitude toward women; of probable Catholic leanings, but touched with skepticism. Looney then reasoned that the true author had had works published before 1593, that he didn't spring forth suddenly as a mature poet with Venus and Adonis, a 1,200-line epic poem. In an anthology of Elizabethan-era poetry, he found a few poems with the same rhyme scheme as Venus and Adonis, one of which was by Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, a person that Looney was not familiar with. As he researched de Vere's biography, it matched Looney's lists of 18 qualities. Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. By the way, as another convention, I'm going to refer to de Vere and Oxford interchangeably. When I say de Vere, I mean the 17th Earl of Oxford and vice versa. The Oxford earldom was the oldest in England at the time. Here's a brief timeline. You can read these for yourself. I just want to highlight 3 of them. He received private first-class tutoring starting at a very early age, probably at age 4. His first tutor was Sir Thomas Smith, a very well-respected and literary man. He was a favorite of the Queen for a time in the early 1570s. She was quite infatuated with him. I'm going to speak later about his 16-month trip to the continent in his mid-20s. And going down to the bottom of the page, Apparently impoverished by the mid-1580s, he was awarded a grant of £1,000 a year by the Queen in 1586, with no accounting to be made for it. This was an extraordinary gift from a cheap monarch. Only one other award of this size was given, and that was to Francis Walsingham for his network of spies. It would be worth, say, $300,000 to $500,000 a year today, at a time when top officials might have earned up to £100 a year. Here's the second part of the timeline. Again, I want to highlight three things from this list. The 1590s were a relatively quiet decade for him. He was largely absent from the court. He seems to have semi-retired. He writes of his weariness at being a courtier. His health is deteriorating. King James becomes king in 1603 after the death of Elizabeth. He orders Oxford's £1,000 grant to be continued. Oxford died June 24th, 1604. There's no gravestone, no funeral, no place of burial is noted, and there's no will known to exist. There are innumerable connections between Oxford's life and events in Shakespeare's works. The volume of parallels is far too great to be simply coincidence. I want to highlight just three during this talk. First, All's Well That Ends Well. The play opens with Bertram, a young nobleman whose father has died, and he becomes a royal ward. He's to be married against his will to Helena, who's beneath his social station. The sovereign fixes that problem by elevating Helena's family to the nobility before the wedding. The same thing happened to Edward de Vere. His father died when Edward was 12. Under English law, when a nobleman died leaving underage male children, they became wards of the crown even if their mother was living. Wardships could be sold, but the most lucrative ones were kept by the crown. So young Edward de Vere went to live in the household of William Cecil, Elizabeth's long-serving and most trusted minister, who also ran the Court of Wards. Cecil House was noted for its large collection of books and its lavish gardens. Records of de Vere's daily academic calendar exist. As a ward, his estates were managed by others. This was the beginning of a lifetime of financial woe. In 1571, Cecil arranged for the 21-year-old Edward de Vere to marry his daughter Anne, who was then 15. Shortly before the marriage, Cecil was elevated to the nobility as Lord Burleigh. It was not a happy marriage, at least for the first years. But again, parallels: a royal ward, Edward de Vere, Bertram. To be married beneath his social station, the monarch fixes that problem by elevating the bride's family to the nobility. I mentioned Edward de Vere's trip to Europe. During his 16-month trip in his mid-20s, he visited France, Germany, Verona, Venice, Sicily, and Genoa. Almost all the Shakespeare comedies and some of the other plays are set on the continent, especially in Italy and France. Two are set in Venice, Othello and The Merchant of Venice. Venice was the most exciting city in the world for arts at that time. Shakespeare knows it well. Oxford was in Venice at a time when relations with the city's Jewish community were tense. The Merchant of Venice plot turns on Antonio, the merchant, being liable to Shylock on a bond for the sum of 3,000 ducats because his ships have supposedly been lost at sea. In 1578, Edward de Vere invested £3,000 in an expedition to find the Northwest Passage and lost it all. The organizer of that expedition was Michael Locke. 3,000 ducats, £3,000. Shylock, Locke. Now let's turn to Hamlet, which is considered by Oxfordians to be the most autobiographical play in many respects. The key characters: Polonius is widely recognized as a caricature of William Cecil. In the play, Ophelia is Polonius's daughter. She would parallel Anne Cecil, who was William Cecil's daughter. Ophelia has a troubled relationship with Hamlet, just as Oxford had a troubled relationship with Anne Cecil. One of Oxford's best friends was his cousin, Horace Vere, who was nicknamed Horatio. Polonius's advice to his son Laertes, neither a borrower nor a lender be, is almost identical to the advice that William Cecil wrote out for his son before he left for Paris. Yet that advice was not published until long after Hamlet had appeared in print. But someone who lived in Cecil's household would probably have heard those precepts many times. The book Hamlet is reading in one scene, where he says words, 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 has been identified by scholars as Cardanus' comfort. Edward de Vere sponsored an English translation of that book in 1572. It's dedicated to him and includes a preface and poem by him. Some scholars see echoes of Beowulf in Hamlet. The only known copy of Beowulf at that time was a manuscript at Cecil House. Hamlet is beset by pirates on his return to England and is stripped of his clothes. The same thing happened to Edward de Vere on his return across the English Channel at the end of his trip. His boat was seized by pirates and he was stripped of his clothes. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, two minor characters in the play. In 1583, Oxford's brother-in-law was sent to Denmark on a diplomatic mission and spent several weeks there. On his return, he wrote letters not published about it, including going to a state dinner where the guests included a Mr. Rosencrantz and a Mr. Guildenstern. Shakespeare's sources. Looking at all the works, scholars have identified hundreds of direct sources used by Shakespeare, works of fiction and nonfiction, in English, French, Latin, and Italian, and probably Greek. Books and manuscripts. Many were in the library of his very first tutor, Sir Thomas Smith. His favorite source is Arthur Golding's 1567 translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses. Golding was Oxford's uncle and tutor, and Golding worked on that translation while at Cecil House at the same time teenage Oxford was also living there. Shakespeare knew of recent scientific theories, such as Copernicus's theory and the theory of circulation of the blood. Obviously, Shakespeare loved literature, read voraciously, and had ready access to books. However, no Shakespeare source material was published after 1604. Let's examine Oxford's connections to the literary world. At least 28 books were dedicated to him during his lifetime. He wrote poetry under his own name until about 1576. Some of that poetry may actually have been written during his teenage years. He sponsored a literary salon through most of the 1580s. He hired Anthony Munday and John Lilly as his personal secretaries, both of whom would become well-known literary figures. Lilly is thought by traditional scholars to be a big influence on Shakespeare, but it's really the other way around. He sponsored an acting troupe, as had his father. He's referred to as a playwright, though no plays exist under his own name. I wonder where they might be. Continuing in 1578, in a Latin oration given to him by Gabriel Harvey, Harvey urged him to abandon his literary efforts for duties more suited to a nobleman and addressed him as Vultus Tila Vibrat, which may be translated as Thy Will Shakespeare's. In 1586, he's recognized as a poet. Quote, many honorable and noble lords and gentlemen of Her Majesty's court are most excellent, skillful, among whom the Earl of Oxford may challenge to himself the title of most excellent among the rest. And again in 1589, a number of His Majesty's servants, quote, have written commendably well, as it would appear if their doings could be found out and made public with the rest, of which number is first that noble gentleman, Edward, Earl of Oxford. Let's examine Shakespeare's general themes. The traditional view is that Shakespeare wrote for the public theater. His motive was monetary. This is one fundamental difference between Stratfordians and Oxfordians. Oxfordians generally believe that the works were not originally written for the public theater, but rather for presentation at Elizabeth's court and at other private venues. Shakespeare's point of view is that of a nobleman. He knows kings, queens, ambassadors, and courtiers. In contrast, he doesn't depict common folk that way. They're two-dimensional stock characters often inserted for comic relief and often with stock names, such as Dogberry, Shallow, Tearsheet, etc. Looking at the entire canon, Shakespeare's overriding theme is the question of royal succession. All the history plays, the tragedies, and even some of the comedies deal with it. Who has the right to the throne? Does some candidate lack a quality necessary to be a good ruler? If this is so, then Shakespeare's intended audience was the queen herself and those closest to her. Most of the plays were written much earlier, in the 1570s and 1580s, when Elizabeth was marriageable and could have had a child. There is much evidence for these early composition dates. Many Oxfordians think the purpose of the £1,000 annual grant in 1586 was to enable De Vere to write new plays and revises old ones for the public theaters, especially the history plays, to help build English patriotism against threats from foreign powers, especially from Spain. Oxford likely spent his last 15 to 18 years revising his works for this purpose and to get them ready for eventual publication. The differences between the quarto editions and the folio versions of many of his plays show evidence of revision. Even so, it was against the law to write or speak about royal succession. This was a totalitarian society. If a commoner was writing such sensitive material, it is impossible to understand why he was never arrested or even questioned about his doings, and why none of his work was ordered suppressed or burned. Shakespeare alone seems to have had a free pass to write about such things. Briefly, two other dominant themes are one, the concealment of identity or mistaken identity, and second, knowledge of the law. Shakespeare thinks like a lawyer. He doesn't flaunt his legal knowledge. He simply uses it. Let's circle back to Will Shakespeare of Stratford. How does he become an author, or at least get his name on published works? In 1593, Venus and Adonis, a 1,200-line poem, is published. This is the first appearance of the writer Shakespeare. It's dedicated to the Earl of Southampton. He must be important to the author if he was the only person to whom Shakespeare dedicated anything. Who was he? He was Henry Wriothesley, the third Earl of Southampton, born in 1573. He's a generation younger than Oxford. There are a lot of theories about the nature of their relationship, but for this talk, it's important to note that, like De Vere, young Southampton became a royal ward when his father died. He too grew up at Cecil House. In 1590, William Cecil tried to arrange a marriage between Southampton and Cecil's granddaughter, 15-year-old Elizabeth Vere, the eldest daughter of Oxford and his late wife. Southampton did not go through with the marriage. Oxford and Southampton certainly knew each other. There's no evidence that Shakespeare and Southampton knew each other. Back to publishing Venus and Adonis. What are De Vere's options for authorship? Well, he can't use his own name. That's political disaster, and it's culturally unthinkable for a nobleman to be writing something for the public to purchase. Items 2 and 3, publish anonymously or use an obviously fake name, are almost as bad, as they raise the question of who really wrote it. The last option is really the only alternative. Use the name of a real person, a frontman. The frontman gets money and social stature. We know that Shakespeare got both, with a coat of arms given to his family in 1596, thereby moving up the social ladder, and enough money to buy a large house in Stratford in 1597. This arrangement also answers the question for the casual reader. Insiders already know what's what. We now have what we would call plausible deniability, and we have someone who can deal with printers and theater companies if need be. This facilitates the dedication to the person whose advancement is being intended with Venus and Adonis, Southampton. Here is the dedication as it appeared in Venus and Adonis, and I call your attention to a key phrase, the first heir of my invention, commonly thought to be the first thing I've written, but we would suggest what it refers to as the first thing written under my new name. The purpose of the publication is political. It's to promote Southampton's stature and assist him in gaining popular support and perhaps even power. In 1594, the second long poem is published, Lucrece, also dedicated from Shakespeare to Southampton. But now the epic poems stop, even though they're very popular. Shakespeare never wrote another dedication. Also in 1594, quartos, individual editions of some Shakespeare plays, begin to appear, but they have no author's name on them. In 1598, quartos begin to appear with the name Shakespeare on them. It appears that the real author now has greater control over the product. These are better quality quartos than the ones that had no author's name on them. Let's jump ahead to 1623, the first folio. It contains 36 plays, about half of which had not been published before. It does not contain Shakespeare's poems, just the plays. Why then, 7 years after Shakespeare's death and 19 years after Oxford's death? Why then, and why continue the cover-up? There are several possible reasons. First, it was a big project. It took time to acquire the rights to plays that had been published and to edit the manuscripts of those that hadn't. Second, political concerns. Puritanism was on the rise. There was a fear that if they weren't published, they might be lost or suppressed. Puritans despised secular public entertainment and wanted the theaters closed. In fact, the theaters were closed 20 years later for a period of 18 years. Third, important persons are still living. Southampton and De Vere's children are living in 1623, and one important person, Anne Shakespeare, Will Shakespeare's widow, died that year. Finally, the folio is dedicated to two brothers, the Earl of Montgomery and the Earl of Pembroke. Montgomery was married to Susan Vere, Edward's youngest daughter, and Pembroke had been engaged to another De Vere daughter. They no doubt financed this expensive project. Ben Jonson, who had supervised publication of his own collected works, was probably hired to edit and certainly was hired to prepare the introductory letters and poems. They appear to make the case for the Stratford man, but they must be read very carefully. Everything is capable of at least two meanings. The people behind the first folio could have stated unequivocally that the man from Stratford was indeed the author, but they didn't. Is the portrait page telling us anything? Here's the Droeshout engraving. Note there's no coat of arms. More tellingly, the portrait has two right eyes. The tunic shapes don't match each side. There's an extra button. It appears that the head is some kind of floating head, maybe mounted on top of a spade, perhaps. And more tellingly, there appears to be a mask. If you look very carefully at this, there's a black line under the left earlobe. It's hard to see, but it's a dark, straight black line suggesting that this is a mask. Is the monument telling us something? Here's the current version of the bust of gentle Will Shakespeare, holding a quill pen in one hand and a piece of paper in the other hand. And what is he holding it on? It's not a writing surface. Here's what the monument looked like in 1636. No quill pen, no piece of paper, and the sitter is holding some kind of wool sack, it appears. What is the monument telling us? The inscription, I call it a monument to misdirection. There's a lot to it. I call your attention simply to one phrase. Read if thou canst, whom envious death has placed within this monument. If you can't read, that admonition is not going to help you. But if you can read, it's suggesting that you read this very, very carefully. In conclusion, why should we care? Because if you have the wrong person as Shakespeare, you have the wrong man, you have the wrong time, you have the wrong audience, and you have the wrong message. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex McNeil. I'm sure that anyone new to the authorship found much to think about in your talk, as I am sure many of us who've been around the subject for a while have found much in that talk. For even more on an introduction to the authorship question, let me suggest you take a look at the website doubtaboutwill.org. That's a website run by the Shakespeare Authorship Coalition. There's a lot of really good material on that, as there is some good material on our own site, Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship.org. Our last formal speaker of the day, Roger Stritmatter, needs no introduction to anyone who's been around the authorship issue for a while. He received his PhD on the basis of a study of Edward de Vere's Geneva Bible. He was the editor of the fellowship journal Brief Chronicles from 2009 to 2016. He's edited books on de Vere's poetry and the First Folio, among others. He's a professor of humanities at Coppin State University. Professor Stritmatter is speaking today about poetic form as code in the First Folio. Roger Stritmatter. Over to you, Roger.
Thank you, Don, and thank you to the Shakespeare Fellowship, the trustees, the members, and the hardworking contractors who have made this event possible. So my title, This Figure That Thou Here Seest Put, Design as Code in the Shakespeare First Folio, is, of course, drawn from the first line of Ben Jonson's epigram prefixed to the 1623 First Folio, about which Catherine Chiljon and Michael Delahoyde have already given us so much to consider. My title is aspirational, and my aspiration is not to convince you of any particular decoding, but rather to revisit the question of post-Stratfordian or Oxfordian approach to the concepts of design and code, and their sometimes beautiful relationship in early modern semiotics. Semiotics is the study of signs, and that includes both visual and verbal signs. Ultimately, both visual and verbal signs are code, and to understand them properly requires an investigation of their code-like attributes. So I'm going to offer here 4 principles for consideration. The first is context. Context matters. There's an elephant in the living room, and we saw just this afternoon in Alex McNeil's really impressive summary of why there's an authorship question, a little bit about that elephant. So when I say context, I mean all the things that you see on this slide: historical, linguistic and literary, semiotic, psychological or biographical, and also scholarly. So this is a bit of a repetition. I'm going to just give 3 slides here that'll give an abbreviated version of what Alex McNeil talked about. And this will be old hat for many of you. But the larger context of our discussion is that the Shakespeare authorship question is very real and a well-recognized topic in the history of ideas. Here is Henry Hallam writing from the mid-19th century of William Shakespeare, whom, through the mouths of those whom he has inspired to body forth the modifications of his immense mind, we seem to know better than any human writer. It may be truly said that we scarcely know anything. Now, most people probably don't know who Henry Hallam is, but he is among the most distinguished intellectuals of 19th century Britain, a polymath author of several classic works, including A View of the State of Europe during the Middle Ages, a 3-volume constitutional history of England, and the 4-volume introduction to the literature of Europe in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. He was the treasurer of the Statistical Society and a founder of it as well, and a very active vice president of the Society of Antiquaries, and an honorary professor of history in the Royal Society, among other notable accomplishments. All that insatiable curiosity and unwearied diligence have hitherto detected about Shakespeare, he writes, serves rather to disappoint and perplex us than to furnish the slightest illustration of his character. It is not the registry of his baptism or the draft of his will or the orthography of his name that we seek. No letter of his handwriting, no record of his conversation, no character of him drawn with any fullness by a contemporary has been produced. And just to bring this up to the present, since time, of course, requires an abbreviation of this history of doubt, which many of you are well aware of through the work of Warren Hope, Kim Holston, and James Warren, here are some brief quotations from Kevin Gilvari's recent The Fictional Lives of Shakespeare. No new information about Shakespeare has emerged from any contemporary document since 1931. The documents offer no insight into the poet's thoughts and motives. Scarcely any of the claims made about Shakespeare as a writer can be verified by reference to historical records. It is not possible to construct a biography of Shakespeare. He remains a complete enigma. But wait, we have this book, right? The book that gave us Shakespeare? The book that proves that Shakespeare was Shakespeare or somebody else of the same name, doesn't it? To explore this question, let's look a little more closely and carefully at the book. When we open it, assuming we have a complete copy with all the preliminary leaves in it, this is what we see. Well, what are we looking at? Bibliographical analysis shows that these 2 pages were among the last printed in the book, and some copies are apparently missing them from the start. There's lots to consider here, but let's start with this. In order to place this overlarge engraving of the author on the title page with an unprecedented puffing, which is an unprecedented puffing of an author in 1623, the title page had to be run through two different presses, one for the engraving and the other for the print. And let me here give a shout out to my friend Dorna Bewley, who is a real expert on the printing of the first folio. Turning to the 10-line tetrameter epigram, that means there are 4 iambic feet per line, signed with the initials BI for Ben Jonson, we may ask, well, what are the first words in this book? The first words we can see are "to the reader" and followed by "this figure." The word figure refers to the engraving by Martin Droeshout the Younger, a talented young Dutch London printmaker from a printmaking family. And Catherine Chiljon has already given you a pretty good briefing on that image. I'm interested in the word figure. Why figure? Why not picture? Available in print in England from 1476, or portrait available in 1477, or engraving available in 1562. Figure should catch our attention, especially placed so close to the literal beginning of the book. The OED definition takes up almost 2 pages and supplies 26 possible uses. Figure is among the most important and complicated terms in aesthetics, literary criticism, and the theory of the arts. It's also a very interesting word in Shakespeare. And as you like it, Jacques uses figure to describe his own reflection in a brook. "I was seeking a fool when I found you. He is drowned in the brook. Look but in and you shall see him. There I shall see mine own figure." In Hamlet, the word figure describes the ghost. Bernardo says to Marcellus in the first scene, "in the same figure like the king that's dead." And later to Horatio, he describes the ghost as this portentous figure which comes armed through our watch. So like the king that was and is, the question of these wars. And the word is echoed a third time when Horatio transmits the message to Hamlet, describing the ghost as a figure like your father, armed at point exactly capape. It appears before them and with solemn march goes slow and stately by. Now, the members of the watch in these first scenes provide some interesting synonyms. The figure is this thing, it's nothing, it's our fantasy, it is like the king, but it is not the king. In Merchant of Venice, we find the image of an angel stamped in gold. Morocco says they have in England a coin that bears the figure of an angel stamped in gold, but that's insculpted upon. But here, referring to Portia, an angel in a golden bed lies all within, suggesting that Portia also may be sort of a figure and not a real woman. A figure is also an interesting word in Ben Jonson's own writing. Let me just give you one example here. This is from the Poetaster, where poets dress themselves up as gods and goddesses. And this is to show that poets, in spite of the world, are able to deify themselves. At this banquet to which you are invited, we intend to assume the figures of the gods and give our several loves the forms of goddesses. And we haven't even got to the most interesting part about the word figure, which is figures of speech. Figures of speech are essential to all literary criticism. And in the original Greek, a figure of speech is called a trope, a word that means a turning away from the literal or a way of saying something indirectly. And so these are just a few examples here. We're familiar with many of these: pun, simile, irony, understatement, synecdoche, the part for the whole, metonymy, asinus, chiasmus, and euphemism. Most striking of all, oops, this is a little bit out of order. So this is fun. There are, according to the artist here, 27 figures of speech. Time flies. When your kingdom's in a nutshell, how many eggs in your basket? If the cat has got your tongue. When you carry some red herrings, make sure you have an ace up your sleeve. Eventually, you're going to kick the bucket anyway. And we could spend some fun time looking at the other ones here, and I could ask you to figure them out, but I think we unfortunately don't have time to do that right now. So let's summarize the word figure in early modern literary discourses. So the root meaning of figure in all these uses is the image, the likeness, or representation of something, or an imaginary form or phantasm. In literary theory, a figure is a deviation from literal language, such as metaphor, simile, or personification. Thus, in both Shakespeare and Ben Jonson, a figure is a substitute for something real, something that is not the thing itself, but a likely representation of it, a kind of dramatic deceit. So this is our second lesson after context. Pay attention to small words and all words. The word figure appearing as the second word in this introductory epigram and the second word in the Shakespeare First Folio should really induce in us as readers the same doubts as engendered by the appearance of the ghost in Hamlet Sr. on the ramparts in Elsinore among Horatio and the watch. Is the ghost real? Can we distinguish truth from illusion in the First Folio? So the third of my 4 lessons is study the forms. And I'll explain in a minute in a little more detail what I mean by forms, but I really want to recommend both of these excellent books on this question. If you really want to know what's going on in early modern poetry, you should check out Alistair Fowler's Triumphal Forms and Mary Douglas's Thinking in Circles. And I'll give you a brief explanation of what they say in there. But first, let's hear from the Bishop of Worcester, the Earl of Worcester in 1st Henry IV, speaking of the conspiratorial and over-the-top Henry Hotspur. He apprehends a world of figures here, but not the form of what he should attend. Good cousin, give me audience for a while. And the two characters meet and speak together, and we cannot hear what they are saying. So while a figure is something transposed or transformed from a more real original, a form is a structure or a set of conventions, and it embodies an idea or provides a framework for composition. So let's think about the problem of form, the question of form in Jonson's other poem in the First Folio. This is an encomium, a poem of praise. It's 80 lines long. It begins with 16 lines of warning about envy and misinterpretation. And then on line 17, it recommences, I will therefore begin. And we don't have time to talk about this wonderful poem in any detail, but the one thing I want you to pay attention to here that we are going to cover is that it has a prominent and obvious ceremonial center. Now, this is a concept that is unfamiliar to us. It may seem strange and foreign to modern readers. We are weaned on the ideals of modern free verse. Yet, as Douglas and Fowler both show in these 2 books, its use is ubiquitous in ancient and early modern literature. Consider the flood story from Genesis 6:10 through 9:19, one of literally hundreds of narrative episodes, poems, and songs in the Bible, including many, if not all, of the Psalms that follow a similar formal and chiastic pattern. It begins with Noah and his sons, and it also ends with Noah and his sons. The second piece is about all life on earth, and the second to the last is about all life on earth. The third section coming into it is a curse on earth, And the third section on the other side is a blessing on earth. And right in the middle, pivotally placed, God remembers Noah. First, the waters increase, and God remembers Noah. And then, presumably on account of God remembering Noah, the waters decrease. So the concept of a ceremonial or privileged center is the result of a series of chiastic paired oppositions that are nested around a center. This one being God remembers Noah. So here's an example that I'm going to show you, and then we're going to go back to the folio encomium. This is by George Chapman's poem To Phoebus. It is 8 lines long, and we can notice, although we don't have time to do a thorough analysis, the first line is about Phoebus, and the last line is about Phoebus. In the first line, Phoebus is a swan, and in the last line, Phoebus is the king of poesy or poetry. Now, right in the middle, we get this interesting in lines 4 and 5, duplication of the pronoun thee. Now, this is distinct from the modern all-purpose you. It's not only a form of address to a deity, but it's also the intimate form of the pronoun, reserved for family or intimate friends. Now, the Elizabethan Jacobean tradition of referring to the Earl of Oxford as Phoebus may or may not be relevant here, and I would not at this moment wish to press that understanding too far. But the duplication of the intimate pronoun in the 2 central lines of this poem readily suggests both the concept of the ceremonial center and the potential use of the center to encode some sort of privileged information. In this case, the privileged information that Chapman is on intimate terms with someone who he calls Phoebus here. So what's the center of Johnson's 80-line first folio encomium? Well, here it is. The 2 center lines are, triumph, my Britain, thou hast won to show, to whom all scenes of Europe homage owe. So the triumphator has been described here as Shakespeare, but really the triumphator is Britain. The Britain is the one that is triumphing here. And then the allusion to the contemporary scene of the proposed Spanish marriage negotiations to marriage Charles I to the Infanta of Spain is fairly clear. Charles and Buckingham, while in Spain during the months that the folio was being printed, were treated to many triumphs during the courtship. He returned to England in October, weeks at most before the folio was for sale in the St. Paul bookstores. Our Shakespeare, Johnson seems to suggest, is a show. Well, what does he mean by show? Well, before we get to that question and answer it, let's talk a little bit more about what a triumph is. The concept of a literary triumph originates in the Roman triumph and other ancient forms, which all privilege the center, just as these poems do, as the place for the one who is triumphant. And as I already said, in this place, Britain is really the triumphator because it has a Shakespeare to show. But here in this slide is how Professor Desmarais accounts for the form in the Shakespeare First Folio. In the well-known dedicatory verse to the memory of my beloved, the author, Mr. William Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, introducing the 1623 folio of Shakespeare's plays, paid tribute to Shakespeare using a curious and generally neglected metaphor. Jonson, in praising the playwright and the British theater, presents Shakespeare as a participant in a triumph, a theatrical form characterized by the surprise entry and revelatory unmasking of disguised aristocrats. Now, I hasten to clarify that Professor Desmarais would probably object to being cited in this context, at least at first. But for me, this quote was a torch in a dark night. So I said, what does Johnson mean by show? Well, he doesn't use the word obviously in the same way all the time, but here is his expostulation with Inigo Jones, the set designer with whom he both collaborated and had a huge falling out with. Oh, shows, mighty shows, the eloquence of masks. What need of prose or verse or sense to express immortal you? You are ye spectacles of state. 'Tis true, court hieroglyphics. So I submit to you that there's a strong case to be made that Johnson's use of show in the first folio encomium is highly ironic. He's saying that Shakespeare is a thing for show, not a real person, not a real writer. There is, however, at least one good precedent for Ben Jonson's use of the word figure to describe the Droeshout. These are verses by Thomas DeLay or possibly someone named Malherbe. I am not entirely clear on this point, but they are, whoever they are by, they are written to accompany the engraving of Montaigne in Montaigne's essays, a work that left a profound and durable imprint in Shakespeare as Ben Jonson would have known. So with help from Elizabeth Waugeman, thank you, Elizabeth, I have been able to determine the force and significance, or she helped me both on the translation and also discussed the implications, the significance of the word figure in this poem. I'm not going to try to read the French. Here is of the great Montaigne a complete figure. The painter painted the body, and Montaigne revealed his marvelous mind. The painter by his art equals nature, but Montaigne surpasses that art in everything that he writes. So there are two main points worth insisting on here. First, the use of the French word for figure in this well-known illustration of a man that all literate Englishmen of the late 16th century knew and admired seems unlikely to be a coincidence. Instead, everything points to Johnson having the Montaigne dedicatory epigram in his mind as he composed his own in the first folio. The parallelism between the two epigrams is reinforced by the prominent role of the two key terms, art and nature, in both. Now, I'm not saying that Johnson may not have also had other pretexts in mind as he wrote, but I think this one must definitely be included among them. A little consideration will show that Johnson has not only modeled his epigram on Montaigne's, but that understanding the model helps to place Johnson's intentions in the foreground. In this epigram, the art of the painter and the writing of Montaigne conspire to produce a complete figure. That is to say, the visual image complements and completes the intellectual and spiritual resources of Montaigne's own essays. The epigram affirms a wholeness and a completeness that is the result of having both the image and the words of the man. Johnson's poem is the opposite of this. Here, the word figure does not complete the artistic values of the literary work, but is set in place of them, in competition with them. The engraver we see in the third and fourth lines was forced into a struggle between art and nature. This struggle symbolizes the struggle within Johnson to reconcile art and nature when the task involves purposeful and, to his thinking anyway, legitimate deceit. Thus, we may conclude that at least one proper sense of the phrase design as code refers to a very special kind of design, the design by the systematic practice of grounding a contemporary meaning in a context that includes a living precedent. So this is lesson number 4, and I'm almost done here. Compare the texts. Early modern writers were trained to read in a comparative fashion, and this is a 16th century engraving of something called a book wheel. It was used by opening all the books placed on it to pages dealing with the same topic, so that the scholar could see what each of these books had to say about whatever subject he or she was interested in. If we don't read early modern texts comparatively, we will miss the code. So just to wrap this up, on one slide, here's my comparison between the Montaigne, the epigram on Montaigne and the epigram on Johnson. In the Montaigne, the entire figure is composed of two parts of the work. The two parts, the work and the engraving of the author. Visual art and poetics are integrated and complementary. Art equals nature, and Montaigne, the writer, surpasses art. It's a high compliment. What Johnson says about Shakespeare is that the figure is put in place of or on behalf of the author. Johnson posits a disequilibrium between the visual and the poetic. Art in his poem is in strife with nature, and the engraver struggles to outdo the life with a necessary illusion, a figure. So in conclusion, these are my 4 rules of thumb for reading form as code. Read the context, notice small words and all words, and think about what they mean in their contemporary context, study the forms in their contemporary context, and compare the relevant texts. So for more information, please consider visiting my website, shakespearesbible.com, and I'm going to put, if I can figure out how to do it here, I think I have to end my share to get to the chat, and I will put these 2 links into the chat. I welcome you to visit. My website has been down for a number of years, and I'm very excited to have it back up and available as a resource for our movement. Thank you for your attention, and check out the chat for those links.
Thank you, Roger. Great stuff. And I think we're all going to be looking forward to your upcoming collection of essays on the first folio, which should be out sometime next year. A whole lot of new and updated information. At this point, I would like to suggest a change of pace. And I will do that by asking a question. What happens when a fardel full of thirsty Oxfordians walk into a bar? SOF trustee and our reigning SOF wine expert extraordinaire, Ben August, he bottles his own Napa Valley wine under the label Earl 17, struggled for a time with that very question. Oxfordians wandering into a bar. The answers can now be found on the SOF members only site under the rubric The Blue Boar Tavern. To explain how it came about and who those thirsty Oxfordians are, let me turn to the man behind the concept, Ben August. Ben?
Thank you, Don. I'll just tell you, being here at the conference makes it that much clearer to me how we can benefit from having our speakers today join us at the Tavern. So I'm here to invite you to join us this Monday. That would be April 11th at 5 p.m. Pacific time at the Blue Boar Tavern. And this is a digital tavern that we've imagined where some of your favorite Oxfordians can share a pint and discuss different ideas and come up with spontaneous ideas and laughs and so on. But imagine just some of our speakers today, Catherine Chilgen, Michael Delohoy, Jim Warren, Cheryl Donovan, Alex McNeil, Bob Prechter, and Roger Stritmatter having a beer, and instead of a presentation, just talking over a pint and having a great time. That is what the Blue Boar Tavern is meant to be. It's unscripted and it's live. So if you join us this Monday at 5 p.m. Pacific time, as a member of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, you'll be able to see how this all comes together. Now, we have an opening cast that is composed of none of the speakers that you've seen today, but we will have guests coming in from time to time after a few of our initial sessions. But let me introduce to you who our opening cast is, many of whom I think you'll know, or all of them. Our first is Dr. Richard Wagaman. He is a clinical professor of psychiatry at Georgetown University and an author of 2 books and numerous articles on Shakespeare. Next, we have Dr. Earl Showerman. He's an emergency room physician living in Ashland. He's written several papers, given many lectures, and his specialty is Shakespeare and Greek. Then we have Bonner Miller Cutting, and she is a musician and a scholar. And she's often referred to as Oxfordian royalty. She's of course an author, and she's one of Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship's most popular speakers. Now we have Hank Whittemore. He's an actor, an author of 2 of my favorite books, one, The Monument, and the other, 100 Reasons Shakespeare Was the Earl of Oxford, and a great speaker, very popular. And then finally, we have Jonathan Dixon, a multi-talented artist, an actor, a musician. He's also won a couple of our video contests over the years, and he serves as our bartender, which is perfect because he's got a background in psychotherapy. So we're going to be at the Tavern this Monday, 5 p.m. Pacific. Really hope you will join us and join the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. We have a short clip from our first episode, and I'll be right back to you, Jennifer.
Better give me one of those Goldens.
Strong one, Hank.
You want to fortify yourself, Hank.
Yeah, well, and the thing too, these people who ask this all the time, they're not hostile necessarily. They just really don't get why this is important. We've got this stuff. And personally, I can see it like if it's Beowulf and you have no chance of ever knowing who wrote something, yeah, better to have it and not know than not have it at all. So, what are your thoughts to share in case we run into any of these other people who ask this all the time? So what does it matter who wrote the works of Shakespeare?
What Winston Churchill said, that.
Right.
I don't like to have my myths tampered with.
There you go. That's important. That's important.
Right. That it's a myth. And he, for some reason, I don't know if he didn't think it mattered, but he didn't want to know. And that's a whole other question. And I, to me,
he said that specifically about Shakespeare, right?
Yeah.
It's
like Dickens saying, I tremble every time I think something might turn up, because he was involved with the birthplace trust. And I think he helped finance something.
Oh, so money might be a factor. It's possible.
Yes, I could tell you that there's something called the Shakespeare Industrial Complex. And they have a billion reasons why they think it matters. And you can count those reasons in American dollars or English pounds sterling, whichever you like. But yes, there's a big investment
That's
in their ideas about this thing, their narrative. And we're the ones who are pointing out that it's just not a rational picture that they're giving to the public. And
I don't know about the rest of you, but I make no big bucks from my work on Shakespeare.
No, we're not making a lot of money from this.
we're not, but they are.
Let me chime in here, because all 3 of you, my friends, have written books. Now, I and Jonathan have yet to achieve that. So I'm going to give you the personal approach that I have with experience regarding the authorship question, because I see it more as a personal benefit rather than as a broader cultural challenge that it actually represents. Because I think if you have what we do have in the Earl of Oxford, an authentic authorship icon, a person whose life matches the works themselves, so that you can understand several very important things. For instance, his obsession with jealous, raging heroes like Othello or Leontes or Posthumus Leonatus, Claudio or Bertram. All these characters represent something of that jealous rage that comes up in males. He works that theme over and over again. Well, you know, the Earl of Oxford did have some questions about the paternity of his first daughter, Elizabeth. So we know that aspect may have been working its through with him. The other thing that so opens up the place for you, besides seeing the psychological or experiential idea of getting behind the author's mask, is his license, his poetic license, the unbelievable the liberty he had with mocking Queen Elizabeth, the Earl of Leicester, Christopher Hatton, or the Duke of Alençon. And when you read those allegorical interpretations of the plays, you know he was special and got away with stuff. So it's getting behind the author's mask that first appeals to me. But I also have two other things that I wanted to say. And one is that when you start being aware of the authorship question, you want to read more. You want to read Shakespeare. You want to read criticism. You want to read history. You want to read Oxfordian writings. And I've gotten sucked into that black hole. And all three of you have contributed to my impoverishment because of this, So you get excited. It excites the imagination in ways that put you in contact with people who are being creative and original in ways that really have fed my life for decades now.
So being in the tavern is such a fun event. I hope you get a sense of it from that little clip. You know, being Oxfordian starts with being in love with the works of Shakespeare. And in this kind of impromptu conversation, unscripted, live, there can be all kinds of wonderful things that come out. And I'm sure if you join the SOF, you'll find it very worthwhile to come and join us once a month at the Blue Boar Tavern. Thank you.
Great stuff. And an Earl 17 toast to you, Ben. We're all raising one to the Blue Boar Tavern. We started today speaking about the first folio and how it will be featured by SOF as a subject of special interest over the next year. That includes our video contest. To tell us about this year's first folio version of our video contest, I'd like to call on video contest chair Julie Sandis Bianchi. Julie.
Henry, be sure to take your scarf. It's supposed to snow tonight. Oh, I didn't know you were here. I'm so sorry. But I've got to get this pulled into the mold. A little bit left here. Oh, I just so much wish I had a bigger broadside than this. But you see, I have to make some larger folio pieces, and this one is just too small. So I sent my grandson down to see Sir Spillman. He has a paper factory. He makes the most beautiful paper from the Dark River. It's the whitest paper anyone has ever seen. So he's supposed to bring me some larger molds and some decals so that I can make folio paper from Master Johnson. Master Johnson, the toil and trouble that he asks of me, this big book that he's making, all the metalsmithing, engraving the mastheads, the pressing, and then the paper. And well, it doesn't grow on trees, particularly not this time, because Master Johnson wants this paper to be the whitest, most beautiful 100% linen rag. Well, it's absolutely unheard of. I really shouldn't be complaining because then I don't have to pick the gray moldy bits out of my fingers every night. Oh, you're wondering about these hangers, are ye? All these pages drying up here are sort of my ever-changing print shop wallpaper. This lot are the authorial background players. Do you know, for every author's name stamped in a book, I had to write this down about this. I find that these poetic-minded people who are working behind the scenes, working in obscurity, inspiring the writer's ideas, recording his wit, opening their purses, or searching their cupboards for overlooked remnants of some unpublished pith. All these well-meaning folk, without whose presence a man's creative work would have been diminished by their mere absence. I just love these people, but I don't know them. Oh, I see I left out the encryption wheel. Have you seen one of these before? I really shouldn't be showing it to you. You know, we printers have to be careful with because we have that star chamber looking over our shoulders, and had to be too careful with the likes of those folks. But it's really just all good fun. I mean, what lord and lady just doesn't like a puzzle, a creative puzzle, or some saucy gossip embedded in a secret code inside a story? Then there's these card games, a special type of card game where you play them with pictures instead of letters. I think, and numbers, I think that just is so much grand fun. Well, these clever folks who dream these things up, if only they didn't have to be so secretive. Maybe someday stories will be told about them. But, I often wonder who they are, and so perhaps in the future, someone will know and it will come out. Oh, no, not me. I don't have time for that sort of research, but if you'd like to take it up, I understand there's a contest, and there's a pretty penny to be had for doing so.
Thank you, Julie. Again, 3 categories in the video contest this year, each one with $1,000 prize. The background to the folio, the foreground of what's in the folio, the underground, what's really contained in the folio. Do a 3-minute video on any of these areas, and you are eligible for this $1,000 prize. We're hoping as well to use the first folio videos that we get for this year for the presentations on the folio that will happen in 2023. So again, I thank you for that, Julie. And that about winds up our Spring Seminar 2022. As was mentioned earlier today, we chose today's date for this symposium because it was as close as we could come to Edward de Vere's 472nd birthday on a weekend. That date was April 12th. So happy birthday, old friend. Before I close, let me remind all the people who have been here today that we shall next hopefully meet again, both in person and with live Zoom possibilities. The board is working on that. We hope to meet in Oregon this coming September 22 to 25. The registration information is just about to come out or has just come out on the website. Take a look at it, register, book your hotel. Our first call for papers for the next conference in September brought in more than 20 proposals, many of which have already been accepted. Our final call for possible papers or panels which you might have in mind for performances, events at the conference, has a deadline of May the 15th. If you're interested in presenting or organizing some kind of event, please get in touch with the SOF Conference Committee as soon as you can. The information is all on the SOF website. It should be really exciting getting back to seeing Oxfordians and friends in person. We haven't done that since we met at the Mark Twain House in 2019. One final word. We are doing everything we can at SOF to keep these Zoom symposia free to everyone, but they do cost real money to put on. Reaching nearly 300 people around the world, as we've done today, is not cheap. If you found any or all of today's events of interest, please make a donation to SOF in any amount. And if you want to be a part of these seminars, these symposium, these conferences, please become a member of the SOF. That really helps a lot. Details on all of these possibilities, again, they are on our website, ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org. And that's it for today. Thanks to everyone who made this event possible. Their names are in the online program. Their bios, their websites are in the online program. Special thanks again to our webmaster, Jennifer Newton. And thanks to each of you for being with us. And do please remember, de Vere, de Bard.